Well, hi everybody. How's it going? I hope everybody's doing well. I have revitalized the East River G3 podcast. It's been quite a while since I've done one of these, probably since October, November or so. But I still would like to do this once in a while when I have, an itch to do it or whatever you want. So today, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to talk about five films or so that I think are kind of underrated or you might not know about. And these are, of course, horror films because that's what we talk about here on the East River G3 podcast. I'm hesitant to use that, much maligned term hidden gems because I don't know, it's overused. And I feel like sometimes that kind of has a connotation like these are movies that are superbly excellent that nobody knows about. Not all of these movies are fantastic, and I think I've said it before, we all know as horror fans a lot of the movies that we watch and we enjoy. We know they're not very good, they're not the pinnacle of filmmaking, but they're very entertaining. Sometimes I do want to watch a extremely well made film with beautiful cinematography and everything. And sometimes I just want to be entertained with a popcorn flick, and that's okay too. So that's really what these are. Now, of course, people are going to watch this and say, "Oh, I know that movie. Of course, I've seen that." Well, of course, I've seen them too. That's why I'm talking about them. I just figured these were ones that aren't talked about quite as often, I think, for some of them. And again, like I said, these are not all of these are of equal production value of, they're not all the same in terms of how much I personally enjoy them, but I do enjoy all of them. So that's basically what we're talking about. I do apologize for my audio quality. I don't have the podcast mic and everything. I just don't do this enough to have one of those yet, but who knows? Before I actually get into it, I should say, funny enough, oh, and before you get scared away by the length of this video, I will put timestamps so you can jump ahead if you want to see the movies or listen to them rather. I will say, I do have to say, shout out to my friend who, for my birthday a couple weeks ago, got me a poster of top 100 horror movies. And it's one of those scratch off posters. So after you see the movie, you can scratch it off and it reveals some cool artwork. There's 100 of them and they're organized by the time they came out. And we're kind of trying to watch all of them. I don't know if we're going to be able to watch all of them in a year, but that's like the plan. So that's been a lot of fun. So I just kind of wanted to mention that. That's kind of what I've been doing. So perhaps that will lead me to doing some more of these podcast episodes. I really did enjoy it when I did them. So far, I'll say we watched Les Diaboliques, Suspiria, Poltergeist, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Lost Boys, and The Descent. I don't know what's next, but there's a lot of good ones on there. All right, so let's get into it. So these are in no particular order or anything like that. I'll just get started with a movie from 2019 called Haunt. And this was directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, and it stars Katie Stevens, who I've never really seen in anything. And as a matter of fact, I think she was on American Idol or something like that. She's a okay actress. She's not really great, but she's fine as a like little scream queen, end girl kind of chick. So this movie, this one isn't an incredible film. This, like again, using the term hidden gem, this isn't one that you must see. It is you can't not see this as a horror fan, but it is a really fun film. Of course, it does have flaws. The plot is, it's silly. It has all the usual horror tropes you've come to expect, but in a kind of slasher film, I really did enjoy this. And the basic plot of this is a group of, teenage kids that go out on like a Halloween night and they're looking to get scared and they find a haunted house. Basically, not like a real haunted house, like an attraction. You go into the haunted house and walk through the rooms and people jump out and scare you, that kind of thing. And they kind of come across one of those and it's very creepy. If you've seen the cover of this, I don't know if this is on Blu-ray actually. I think this is just streaming, which is unfortunate if I'm correct, but you've probably seen the different masks of the people that are in the haunted house. There's a clown, a ghost, a witch, a zombie, and it's very creepy. They don't talk or anything like that. And the movie is basically them going through this haunted house, and they kind of quickly realize you probably can guess the plot that they're get killed off. It's going to be for real. Not the most unique plot ever. Again, it's not the best movie I've ever seen, but I was very surprised by this movie. I saw some people talking about it, and I think I said it came out in 2019, so it's very recent. And I kind of watched it around, I think I watched it around Halloween time last year. Just, I saw people talking about it. I saw that poster, which kind of caught my eye. I always liked masks and things like that in the movies. They had a creepy simplicity to them. I have to say, I was fairly surprised by this movie. It was very fun. I thought that the setting was very unique. The haunted house, the layout of the haunted house was very cool. The imagery was very cool. And there were a lot of good kills in this movie. And there were a lot of gruesome kills as well that were kind of surprising. There were a lot of a little bit over the top, which is totally fine with me, but almost like, oh, I wasn't expecting that in a movie like this, something kind of run of the mill. So I really enjoyed it. And you're kind of waiting the whole movie for basically the employees of the haunt, to take their masks off, because it's going to be creepy when they do, and of course they do. I won't spoil it, but it's really fun. The ending of this movie is kind of bad, to be honest. I think it's a really fun movie, and the ending kind of sours it. And to an extent, it's kind of lame. A lot of other people have shared that sentiment, but most of the movie is pretty good. It's one of those movies where you really see how a setting can really carry a movie, because if this didn't take place in this haunted house, if they didn't have this really good set design and costume design, this movie would not work at all. If it was in I don't know, like a meat packing facility or a warehouse, something like it just wouldn't work as well. So the setting and the costumes really carry this movie. The acting is a little lame for some people. Some of the dialogue is a little cheesy, but it's not so bad that it's not watchable. I think it's a really fun movie. And if you haven't seen it, and obviously these are all for horror fans. If you're not a horror fan, you're not going to like any of these movies, really. But if you are a horror fan and you haven't seen this one, I definitely recommend it. It's not going to blow you away, but you'll probably have a lot of fun with it. So that's Haunt from 2019. It's one that I will continue to watch, really. It's good enough to where I look forward to seeing it again. Like I said before, I don't think it's on Blu-ray, but if it is, I'd like to get it. And to be honest, if they were to put it on Blu-ray, if they wanted to make some extra money, it would be really smart of them to sell different editions with the different villains masks on the cover. That's something you would kind of expect them to do. So anyways, that's Haunt. On to the next one. So this next one I really like. I really, really like this film. It's one of my favorite horror movies, and it's John Carpenter's Vampires. And this one came out in 1998. It's starring James Woods, Daniel Baldwin, and Cheryl Lee, from Twin Peaks, Laura Palmer, and Thomas Ian Griffith, who is from, I believe, Karate Kid Part 3. He's kind of the villain in that movie. Very scary in this movie, very different. Of course, this obviously John Carpenter. So to some people, they've probably seen this movie. John Carpenter is one of the horror director greats. But this is one of his, I don't know if this is one of his lesser known films. It's certainly one of his more underrated films, I think. And again, if you're more of a little bit of a casual horror fan, it's possible you haven't seen this movie. Like a lot of the other ones I'll talk about, again, it's not the best movie ever made, but it is extremely entertaining. So this one I have a little bit more to say about. So I really like vampire movies. Like us horror fans, we always have a little niche or a little subgenre that we really get into. Some people like the exorcism, haunting kind of films like The Conjuring or The Exorcist, things like that. I really like vampire movies, and I'm not quite sure why. I think it's because, obviously this goes for a lot of other genres as well, but there's so much variety that you can do in this kind of subgenre. You can portray the vampires in so many different ways. You can do it like Twilight if you want. You could do it like Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is I really like that movie, even though it kind of has some silliness in it. And you could do it like 30 Days of Night, where they're super aggressive, animalistic, brutal. Or you can do it like John Carpenter's Vampires, where they have a little bit of the human element to them, but they are just like awful. They're just brutal, super savage abominations, basically. And this movie is like John Carpenter's take on a Western almost. It has that Western vibe because I'm not exactly sure where it takes place, somewhere in the Midwest kind of area, like Texas or Arizona. It kind of has that kind of feel, just big, open, dusty plains in the desert with those rundown motels, that sort of thing. And James Woods and Daniel Baldwin play a pair of vampire hunters, basically. And they're basically the anti hero kind of gunslinger almost, where they are the ones doing the good. They're going and killing the vampires, but they're not good characters. They're not morally righteous. They're loudmouth, profane, bad. They're assholes basically, but they're the ones that are putting the work in. And it's just a ridiculous movie. It's very over the top. It's cheesy and campy almost at some points, but it still has the John Carpenter grit to it. I think this is one of his more violent films, really. This movie is extremely violent, very gory, and it has chef's kiss practical effects in it. If you're a practical effects hound like I am, you're going to like this one. And really, it's the way that the vampires are portrayed. Basically, they're going around going into like they call them like dens, basically, an old abandoned house where a bunch of vampires kind of are held up, and each basically harem of vampires has a master vampire associated with it. And in this one, you have a master vampire, again played by Thomas Ian Griffith, named, I believe, Jan Valak. And his goal is basically to steal this cross from the Catholic Church, which is going to allow him to make all the vampires walk in the sunlight. Because, of course, vampires can't walk in the sunlight in this movie, as they often can't in most vampire movies. In this movie, if the vampires go into the sunlight, they fucking burst into flames. It's not pretty. They burst into flames and explode. It's awesome. The way that they deal with killing these vampires is with extreme brutality and with no hesitation. They stab them in the fucking head. They stab them in the heart. They cut their heads off. And they shoot them with shotguns, blow their limbs off. It's crazy. The vampires in this movie, I always like this. The blood of the vampires is black, so it's like foul and damned. It's very putrid and wrong almost. It was a very nice touch. John Carpenter also did the music for this one, as he does with most of his movies. It's fitting. I can't say it's his best soundtrack. It's certainly not very memorable like Halloween or something like that, but it's fine. This is a movie that it gives you the best of both worlds, really, because it shows that like the religious aspect, they went that angle with like the Catholic Church and how they're abominations of Christ, basically, and that sort of thing. And the vampires, like I said, are portrayed in an extremely animalistic, brutal, savage way. It's no bullshit, but it's also so cheesy. It's so fun. It's a very entertaining movie. You will also get to see the vampires in this movie just decimate people, especially Thomas Ian Griffith, just annihilating people. It is super gory. I mean, he just decimates people in this movie. It's very violent. So I really like this movie. I saw this movie when I was way too young, like way too young. I was probably like 10 years old when I saw this. I saw it on TV and it was still violent. But then I went and rented it from Blockbuster a couple of years later and, saw it uncut and was like, holy shit, this is violent. I always really like this movie. I mean, there's not much more to say. I don't want to spoil too much, but this is a really fun movie. It's not the best, again, not the best movie ever made, but if you want to see some vampires killing in a very savage way with beautiful special effects, then watch this movie. It's very enjoyable. It's one that I often watch, and it actually just got a special edition Blu-ray release, which is really cool. I believe from Scream Factory, and they did a custom cover, custom artwork illustration. I always really like when they put out Blu-rays and they do a different cover. It gives it a little bit of character to own that particular Blu-ray. I don't own it myself, but I'd like to. So this is John Carpenter's Vampires. If you like vampires, if you like practical effects, violent movies, it's very violent. So if you can't handle gore, don't watch it. But if you do like that and you haven't seen it, I really suggest you check this one out. You will really like it. So that's that one. Let's go on to the next one. So this next movie is a little bit different. So it's not necessarily a horror film. It's a dark fantasy, but I think it's got so many horror elements and so much dark imagery. I think it would classify as a horror film, dark fantasy horror. And I really, really like this film. I think it's probably one of the most well-known movies on this list, but I'm going to talk about it regardless. And that's Legend from 1985, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Tom Cruise in what I believe is his first role, actually, Mia Sara, and Tim Curry, one of the best actors ever. One of the best chameleon actors. I mean, he really changes, and he plays basically the devil in this movie. They refer to him as Darkness, but he's basically the devil, and he is in so much makeup that he's almost unrecognizable. Just so good in this movie. His performance is superb, as it is in most movies. Even in something as small as Home Alone, he gives it his all. So this movie, probably a lot of people have seen, but there are two different cuts of this movie. And this has been talked about, of course, but I thought I would give my 2 cents on it. There's the US release. It's often referred to as the theatrical release, but I'm a little bit fuzzy on some of the details of it, but the basic gist, I think it was originally released like in Europe and places like that, and then it was recut for United States audiences. So that is generally referred to as the theatrical cut. That is the United States release. And I think that's what a lot of people have seen, at least from my experience when I see people talking about the movie. A lot of people refer to the theatrical to film. And they're very different. The director's cut, and that's specifically what I'm talking about today, my favorite version of the movie by far, is quite different. It's a fair bit longer. I think it's 20 to 25 minutes longer. It might even be a half an hour longer. It's a quite substantial amount of content that was cut from the theatrical release. It has a completely different score, and it's a very much darker film. It's a lot darker. It plays out much more like a dark fantasy, like Dark Crystal or something, and really is almost like a horror film, which is why I'm talking about it. You don't really get that so much in the theatrical release, a little bit, but I always feel like the theatrical release feels a little bit more like your standard 80s fantasy film, like more akin to like Neverending Story or something like that, where there's some spectacular visuals, but it's cheesy and more of like a little bit of a fun experience. And of course, the director's cut is not perfect either, and it has a pretty simplistic plot, which is basically like Tom Cruise stars as your hero, Mia Sara is the princess who gets kidnapped by darkness, and he's basically trying to kill the unicorns so he can harvest their horns and make darkness reign forever. No more sunlight, basically. Very simple plot, very standard fantasy plot. I mean, of course, the plot is the same in both versions, but I feel like the director's cut goes much further into being much darker and much more grim. Macabre, I'd say, is probably the best way to describe the director's version. Macabre. It is very, very dark and just, I don't know, it just oozes like darkness, which is a very appropriate term for this movie considering the plot. But, you know, one big difference between these two versions that a lot of people talk about is the soundtrack. The theatrical cut, the US version, uses a Tangerine Dream soundtrack. And there's a lot of debate over which version is better. there's no clear answer. Of course, it's personal taste. I personally think Jerry Goldsmith's score for the director's cut is by far the better version and is quite honestly one of his best scores he's ever done. Now, of course, that was the original score that they had him do, and then they had Tangerine Dream come in and do a soundtrack for the U.S. release. It is a good score, but like I said before, it makes it feel much more like fantasy movies of that era, very 80s. Like, it's a synthesizer-based score. The Tangerine Dream was very popular in the 80s, and they're still around, but they're a electronic synthesizer-based band. Jerry Goldsmith's score completely radically changes the film and makes it much darker. And it's a beautiful, gorgeous score. And again, I think it's one of his best scores ever. And this has happened to him before, like Alien, the original Alien, another Ridley Scott film. They famously cut a lot of his material that he wrote for that movie. So this is something that's happened to him before. Thankfully, we can watch the director's cut now with his score intact and everything like that. But there are a lot of scenes in this movie that are not in the original, I shouldn't say original, the US theatrical release that make this very dark. This pushes into, I have seen some people talk about it's a PG rated film. And a lot of people have said this is one of the movies that was responsible for the PG-13 rating. I'm not sure if that's true or not, because I feel like the PG-13 rating did come out in 1985. I know like Temple of Doom and Gremlins were definitely responsible for the PG-13 rating. But, yeah, I could definitely see that. This is not, this would not be rated PG today. It is way too dark and scary. There's violence in it. It's not bloody. It's one of those movies where there's violence, but you never see any blood, but there's beheadings. It's just very, very dark and scary. A lot of the imagery is very scary in this movie. So, honestly, I don't want to spoil too much of the plot. It is a simplistic plot, but it's one of those movies you really just need to experience for yourself. There's some absolutely incredible imagery in this movie. The sets are unbelievable, and to my knowledge, most of this movie was shot. In fact, I think all of this movie was shot on a soundstage. So basically everything you're seeing is a set. Outrageously good. You just simply don't see stuff like this anymore in modern films. No CGI. Not just the CGI though. Yes, you're going to see some excellent practical effects and puppetry and things like that. Really good costume work and prosthetic work and every wonderful makeup work. But just the sets are so good. The dressing of the sets too. Whoever was the set dresser just did a great job. So this movie, honestly, I know it's not very violent. It's a PG rated film. It's not that scary, but I think that it's very dark enough where a lot of people might be creeped out by it if they're not horror fans. So if you are a horror fan and you haven't seen Legend, give it a shot. It's a little cheesy. There is some wonky dialogue. There is some dubbing in this movie as well. Some of the actors were not, English or American, so they had thick accents and they had to redub them. It's a little bit jarring, but I still suggest it. I think it's the sum of its parts, and it makes a very exquisite film. This one actually is on Blu-ray now. You can get an Ultimate Edition Blu-ray, which has both cuts. I used to just have the director's cut on DVD. I haven't watched both of them in full yet. I'm actually waiting to do that with my friend, because he reminded me actually he had seen probably the theatrical cut way back in the 80s. As a kid, he said it scared the shit out of him, but I did do some skimming. There's been some debate, if you're one of those people that really likes, like how transfers are and how the Blu-ray release is, things like that. Most people, the movies are both going to look fine. They're not the same transfer. But again, like they're going to look fine. It's not like the theatrical cut is a bootleg and it looks like crap or anything. They both look very good, but there are some differences between the two. A lot of people have said that the director's cut is of a lesser quality. The video quality isn't quite as good. And again, I haven't watched both in full, so I can't comment on that totally, but I did skim and I think the director's cut looked very good. I will actually say from my limited viewing of it that I found actually the director's cut had more darker color to it, very vivid color, but very dark. So I actually think it works in its favor for the director's cut. The blacks are just more black. It has much more of a dark atmosphere to it. It really works for that movie. Very dim and like just like damp, musty. I don't know if that makes sense to describe a film, but that's like a lot of the imagery when you're in the darkness's layer and everything. It just feels so macabre and dim and damp. It's this movie has some just beautiful cinematography in it. So yeah, I definitely recommend this movie if you have not seen it. I'd say if you haven't seen it, it's a must watch. So that's Legend from 1985, and let's go on to the next one. So this next movie is a French-speaking film. If you're one of those people that can't watch foreign films with subtitles, you skip it. I think it's a really good horror movie, though. It's a great horror thriller movie. I wouldn't say it's necessarily super obscure. A lot of horror fans have seen this one, but it's still one that isn't always on the top lists, and it's a great film, and that's Les Diaboliques. I just butchered that title. Les Diaboliques. I can't speak French to save my life. Funny enough, in the US, this was just released as Diabolique. They cut the lay. I don't know why. I'm pretty sure that translates to the devils. So I guess it's just called Devils in the US. I don't know why they did that, but this came out in 1955. So it's quite an older film. It's in black and white, but it's still a very good film. There's plenty of fantastic horror films from past years, quite a long time ago that are still good. And this one was particularly notable when it came out because it has a twist ending. I'm of course not going to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it, but I feel like this was one of the first movies that had like a big twist ending to it. As a matter of fact, after you watch this film, there will be a title card that pops up that tells you not to spoil this movie for your friends. It was that big of a deal back then. And it does have a pretty good twist in it. Some people might see it coming, but regardless, it's cool. This was directed by a man whose name I'm going to butcher for you right now, Henry Georges Clouzot, starring Simone Signoret, Vera Clouzot, I don't know if they're related, and Paul Mérisset. I probably butchered those names, but those are the people involved. The basic plot of this movie is you have like a boarding school for boys, and you basically have the headmaster of the school, the principal, if you will, and his wife. And her friend is like the head teacher or the headmistress, if you will. And the headmaster's wife, she does not like him. He's very abusive and a bad guy. So her and the headmistress, the head teacher, basically plot to kill him and get rid of his body. That's the basic plot. And unfortunately, it doesn't go as planned. It becomes very creepy. And unfortunately, I can't really talk about too much of the plot of this movie because it's one of those movies where you will just ruin the experience by talking about it. You have to see it to see how it unfolds. But it unfolds in a very entertaining way. It's very tense filled. It has a lot of dread to it. Nothing's going to work out for the characters involved, but you just can't wait to see how it doesn't work out for them. That's the basic way that I would describe this movie. I really enjoy this movie. I think that the plot of it is really entertaining. I think the acting is very good in this movie. And the way it all unfolds basically is super thrilling to watch. It's a very, very good film. Again, I'm not really sure how well known this movie is. I could be totally off, and this is like one of the most acclaimed movies. It was on my list of 100 greatest horror movies, but I don't see it talked about too often. If you're one of those folks who, I'm not trying to gatekeep or anything, so please don't think that or anything, but if you're one of those horror fans who your bread and butter is like the slashers of the 80s and stuff like that, and you haven't seen this movie, I certainly recommend it. If you've never really checked out a lot of older movies that are horror based, I think you'll like it. I mean, I really, and it's not even one of those movies where it's like you know, it's good because it shows you where we came from. It's not like that. Like it is just a good movie. There are some horror movies that are older that aren't really good by today's standards, but it's good to watch them to see how we got to where we are. No, I think this is really just a very entertaining film. It's a good film. Um, One thing that's interesting about this movie is that I never realized it the first time I watched it. Actually, again, I just watched it with my friend I watch a lot of horror movies with. There's not a lot of score in this movie. I mean, I'm a musician, so of course I really appreciate music in a film, and I think almost all of us would agree that music can radically change a film. But I don't know if there even is a score in this film. There might be, but I think like 99% of this movie there is no music, which is very odd, to not have any music in a horror film. Especially horror movies, the music can really change a scene. But I think the lack of music in this movie actually adds to the tension and the dread factor of it a lot. The silence is deafening. I know that's a cliche, but it's true in this movie. There are scenes where you have characters walking slow as hell down hallways. I mean, a snail's pace, and you're just like waiting for that release, and there is no sound, there's no music, nothing. And that's something I really appreciated in this movie is a use of silence. Again, I love music, of course, but silence is something that I think specifically nowadays is not utilized very well. Silence is very important in movies. It really helps set a scene. So yeah, that's something I really like about this movie. I think, I really like this movie. I'm not super big on the trivia with it. I think there are two versions of this. There's a US release that has a lot of content cut from it. That's a fair bit shorter than the original release, but I haven't ever dug deep enough into it to see if there's a different release of this. This one actually has been released on the Criterion Collection, which, if you're a Blu-ray collector or you do that kind of thing, you'll know that's like the granddaddy of distributors. They do great transfers, and the packaging and the whole shebang is fantastic with Criterion. I don't have that version. I just watched a stream of it on. It's actually on HBO Max right now if you want to watch it. But there is a Criterion release if you would prefer a Blu-ray version. It's not 4K, it's 1080p. But they did some different artwork for the cover, and I've said it earlier. I love when they do like an illustration for the cover of a new release. It gives it that particular release some character, and I think the artwork that they did for this version is fantastic. So I really like this movie. It's a lot of fun. It has a great plot. It has great pacing. It has great tension. It's just a must see, I really think. And I don't think it's talked about as much as it should be, whether or not it's an influential film or not. So that's Diabolique. Um, yeah, I can't speak. From 1955. So I suggest you check it out. And let's go on to the next one. And I will say before I finish, there's two more films. I really had like one more film that was my recommend, and one more is maybe like you could say an honorable mention because it's really not very good, but it's kind of fun. It's kind of funny when you try to think of like the more underrated films that you like. I couldn't think of anything. I mean, there's plenty that I have. I just couldn't think of any. You know how that goes. But yeah, I have one more that I'll definitively recommend to you to watch if you haven't seen it, and we'll get on to that one. So I have one more movie that I would recommend to you, and then one kind of honorable mention that is not one that is very good, but kind of thought I'd put it on here. This one that I'm going to talk about right now is probably the least on my list, probably the one I like the least. It's not that great, but there's something about it that I really like, And again, these are all kind of movies that are, again, not hidden gems. Some of them aren't even necessarily underrated. They're just movies that have some weird little thing about them that I always enjoy that keeps me coming back to them. This one is called As Above, So Below, and this came out in 2014. A lot of you have probably seen this one since it's kind of recent. It was on Netflix for a while. I think it's actually still on there. And again, it's probably the one I like the least. It's very generic in its plot and it has a lot of the typical issues you would expect with a horror movie of modern ages. And it is also a found footage film, and those have run its course basically at this point. Almost 2014 is like too late to be putting out a found footage film. I feel like that kind of genre has already run its course at this point. But there are some things about this movie I like. The basic plot of this movie, it's kind of weird. I checked it out because it was on Netflix. I saw a lot of people talking about it, and I thought, I might as well watch it. And I enjoyed it a little bit. And the basic plot is like they're going. I would say it first caught my eye because it was a group of people going down into the catacombs under Paris. So that kind of I liked that idea of going down there, and I think they actually shot some of this movie in the catacombs. I don't obviously not all of it, but I think they actually did get some shots down there, if I'm correct. So I liked that aspect of it. And it's kind of like these people are looking basically for the Philosopher's Stone. Nicholas Flamel's Philosopher's Stone. They're basically looking for it. I know you're probably thinking Harry Potter. And in some ways, this movie's like an adventure film, almost honestly, like a Tomb Raider film. The main character, oh, I should say the director of this movie is John Eric Dowdle, and it's starring Perdita Weeks, who's a British actress. And she's the main character. She's basically Lara Croft, essentially. And that was one of the things that kind of surprised me about this movie is, yeah, it's a horror film. It's a found footage horror film, but it has a lot of like fantasy elements with the Nicholas Flamel, and it has like an adventure aspect, almost like Tomb Raider. Really, she really does feel like Tomb Raider in a way, going down there. And that was something I wasn't expecting, and I kind of liked it. I don't think it was done very well, but it was a little bit of a unique blend of, you don't really see that a lot, a horror movie that is mixed with like a Tomb Raiding adventure style thing. You don't see that really ever, really. So I kind of appreciated that. And it's really the plot is they're going down there with their camera crew and they're trying to get the Philosopher's Stone, and that's the basic gist of it. And they kind of know from like folklore that somewhere down there is the gateway to hell. And this film kind of uses Dante's Inferno, Circles of Hell, as a lot of the basis for how the catacombs are laid out. And first, I'll tell you my problems with the movie before I get into what I really like about it. The problems are that, well, first off, it's a found footage horror movie, so it's not going to really be that great. You're not going to sit down and watch this and go, holy crap, this really blew me away. This was great. It's not one of those movies. It just isn't. But it's kind of fun. So there's kind of some enjoyment to be had there. My second biggest qualm with the movie, and really probably actually my biggest qualm with the movie, is the main character, who's, I think her name was Scarlett. I can't even remember, but Perdita Weeks' character is just, she's simply a Mary Sue. That's a trope that happens a lot in movies. It happens with male characters as well, where they're fantastically amazing in every way. They're able to solve every problem in the film right away. If she has a problem, they can't figure out like a little puzzle how to get out of the room. She figures it out. She knows. She pulls it out of her ass and figures it out. It's like that exposition dump kind of thing, a deus ex machina where the solution is just handed to the main character. That happens a lot in this movie, and that's my biggest qualm. And again, this is the least on my list, and it's one that a lot of people might be like, Jesus, this chick sucks. Because she just is able to pull the solutions out of thin air. She knows everything, and it happens a lot. It's very annoying. It happens in a lot of movies, regardless of the character's gender. It just happens a lot, and it's something that really annoys me because it lowers the stakes immensely. This movie puts them in some pretty crazy situations, and they're cool situations. There's lots of cool set piece kind of. It's one of those movies where the setting of the movie carries the film rather than everything else. but you know that it's going to get solved pretty quickly. A lot of this movie, this is kind of an esoteric kind of one, but if you grew up in the 90s and you watched Nickelodeon, you're probably aware of the game show Legends of the Hidden Temple, where they went through the temple and there are all those crazy rooms and there's temple guards and stuff, and each room had a little puzzle that you had to solve to get out of it. I kind of got that vibe from this movie a little bit. It's not jungle based, it's very dark and dim, and it feels claustrophobic and uncomfortable. Again, the setting really carries this movie. I really like the setting of this movie, but a lot of like little puzzles and traps and stuff kind of felt like that. Again, like Tomb Raider. So I really like that. And as they go deeper down in the catacombs and they basically cross over into hell, and basically everything gets switched, kind of, so to speak. They're starting to kind of go through what they went through before, but in a more twisted, demented sort of way. And I really liked that. The set design was just really good in this movie. There was some not really creature design. You do see some things that are just have some great imagery in this movie. Um, but it's one of those movies where it has a brilliant setting. Some of the set design is great. Some of the imagery is great. You see some creepy things that are just, it's one of those movies. I think I like it because it's one of those like weird subgenres. And I don't even know if this is a subgenre. I talked about this earlier, but it's very hard to explain. There are these kind of movies where like your characters are basically in situations where it's like there's no going back. Like we can only continue through this shitty enclosed situation we're in. There's some horror movies like that, and I always like it because it puts your characters in just very uncomfortable settings where you know they can only go forward, and you know it's probably only going to get worse. And I think that factors into a little bit of a dread factor, which I've talked about before in some reviews, where dread is something that I think is underutilized in a lot of films. That it's like a tension, like a stakes thing almost. The characters it's a combination. I know I'm ranting a little bit, but it's basically a combination of the stakes that your characters are in, a high stakes situation, in a situation that is very uncomfortable and claustrophobic. It's kind of a dread factor sort of thing, a little bit, and that's what this movie gives you. And again, unfortunately, a lot of it, you get it, and they take it away from you right away because the characters are able to solve these situations so quickly and so effortlessly out of thin air, and that's very unfortunate. But I still thought the setting was very unique. I wish that it was done a lot better. This is a movie where I don't know if they've remade it. I don't know. It's not like they're going to remake this movie, but if someone, I'd like to see a catacombs based film just done a lot better than this movie, I think is what I'm trying to say. But I still think it's worth watching for the setting alone. I still think it's worth checking out. I didn't leave this movie like totally pissed off, like this was a piece of shit. I can't believe I wasted 90 minutes of my life watching this. I kind of thought that it was pretty enjoyable and it had some good things, but it was like had a lot of issues as well. I know that's not lot to say about this, and it seems a little negative, but I still suggest this one. I think that there's some unique things that if you haven't seen this and you're a big horror fan, I think you might find a few things about this that are pretty enjoyable to you. I don't think you'll go away from this totally pissed off. I think you'll have a pretty fun time. So I just actually have one more real quick little honorable mention because it's just what came into my head, and this would absolutely be at the bottom of the list of how much I like these movies. But there's still a little bit something, there's always that little special something you like about horror movies. Again, I'm sure there's plenty more that I just can't think of right now, but this is a movie called Grave Encounters, which came out in 2011, directed by Colin Minahan and Stuart Ortiz, and it's starring Sean Rogerson, Ashley Grisco, and Mackenzie Gray. And if you've ever seen the TV show on the Travel Channel called Ghost Adventures, it's like that totally ridiculous, like hokey, totally like set up staged show where they have ghost people go basically into like a haunted hotel or a prison or whatever, and they like try to find ghosts. It's all bullshit. It's totally ridiculous and set up, but it's basically a movie of that. Except, of course, as is like a lot of the other movies, like Haunt, they go in there expecting it to kind of be bullshit, and it turns out it's not the case. It's really haunted, and like they get trapped in there. This one is not really good. It's not really a great film. It has a lot of issues in it, but again, I like the setting a lot. They're trapped in this area and they can't get out. You know, it just keeps going wrong. And again, this is a movie where the setting really helps this movie, and it's that little particular thing that it's so hard for me to describe that I really like, where they're just trapped in this setting. It's very claustrophobic feeling. Even like As Above, So Below really feels, it has tinges of The Descent, where they're totally stuck underground. They're not getting out of there. You know, it's just worse. They're going to keep going and going, and they just can't get out. And I like that aspect of it. There's a few fun moments. This one, again, is very low on my list, but I suggest checking it out. You can find it on like Amazon Prime or something. There is a sequel to this movie, but it's pretty fucking bad. It's bad, so it's almost not worth watching. Not a lot to say about this movie, but I thought I'd throw it on there. So these were 5 movies that I consider to be a little bit underrated. Again, I don't know. I don't know what this list is, if it's hidden gems or underrated films or truly movies that I just always have a little bit of a special connection to, that I don't think are always talked about as often as they should be. And that's what this was. I hope that this was useful to you guys or entertaining to listen to. I know it's going on quite a long time, but I'd like to say what I have to say about them. Um, so yeah, if you haven't seen these, I hope you check them out and enjoy them. If you don't, that's cool too. But if you do, let me know, in the future if you enjoyed them. And if you've seen these, let me know if you like these movies. And again, of course, if you have other movies that you think are fairly underrated horror movies, let me know, because I'm sure me and the listeners would love to hear that kind of stuff. So thank you for listening to this East River G3 podcast. It's been quite a while since I've done one, and I hope to do some more in the future pretty soon. Got a lot of horror movies, like I said, I'm going to be watching, so I think it would be the perfect opportunity to do some more episodes. So I hope everybody's doing well. Stay scared. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.